In the 21st century, among allies who built the modern world order together, one of them openly says that using the military to acquire territory is always an option, not against an enemy, but against a partner. Greenland, vast, icy, sparsely populated, has suddenly become the stage for a question far bigger than maps or minerals. The United States says it needs the island for security. Europe responds with a rare, unified message. Sovereignty is not negotiable. Ireland's Prime Minister puts it simply, common sense must prevail. I'm Fareed Zakaria, and what you're watching is not a dispute over land. It's a stress test of NATO, a challenge to the UN Charter, and a warning about how power is being redefined in our time. If this conversation matters to you about alliances, rules, and restraint, stay with me. Because to understand where this is going, we first need to be clear about what is really being questioned here. Let's slow this down and define the problem clearly. Greenland is not a vague frontier. It is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark with its own parliament and self-government. Denmark is a NATO member. Greenland's people are not passive assets. They are political actors with rights recognized under international law. And yet, the language coming from Washington shifts the frame entirely. This is no longer about cooperation or basing rights. It is about acquisition, options, leverage, power. European leaders responded with unusual speed and unity, reaffirming that borders, sovereignty, and territorial integrity are not suggestions, they are rules. Ireland's Prime Minister voiced what many were thinking, but few were saying aloud. This moment demands common sense. Because if allies begin to speak the language of force toward each other, the entire architecture of post-war security begins to crack. To see why this moment feels so dangerous, we need to step back and understand how Greenland ended up at the center of a much older strategic story. To understand why Greenland keeps resurfacing in moments of global tension, we have to look backward. Greenland's strategic value did not begin with Donald Trump. During the Cold War, the United States established a military presence there because geography, not ideology, dictated reality. The Arctic was a front line. Early warning systems, missile trajectories, and access to the North Atlantic made the island indispensable. That logic never disappeared. What changed was the world around it. The Cold War ended. Globalization softened borders. Power was restrained by rules, institutions, and habits of cooperation. Greenland became quieter, strategically important, but politically settled. Now those restraints are weakening. Security thinking is reverting to geography and control. The Arctic is no longer peripheral. It is central again. Climate change is opening roots. Great power competition is returning. And in that environment, old calculations feel newly urgent. But urgency does not erase law. Greenland's status did not freeze in time. It evolved toward autonomy, representation, and recognized sovereignty within Denmark. And that tension between timeless strategic logic and modern political reality is where today's crisis begins to take shape. Because history doesn't just explain the moment. It prepares the conditions for the first real shock. The first shock came not with troops or treaties, but with words. When the White House said that using the US military was always an option, something subtle but profound shifted. This was no longer speculation or bravado. It was an official signal, carefully phrased, deliberately ambiguous, and impossible for allies to ignore. Within hours, European leaders closed ranks. Not just Denmark, but Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, a rare collective voice. Their message was restrained, almost diplomatic, but unmistakable. Greenland belongs to its people, and decisions about its future are not subject to pressure. Denmark's Prime Minister went further, warning that an attack on Greenland would mean the end of NATO itself. That was not rhetoric. It was a statement about red lines, about what happens when the logic of force enters, alliances built on trust. If you're trying to understand how fragile the global order has become, pay attention to moments like this. They reveal stress fractures before the earthquake. Because what looks like a single remark is often the surface of something deeper, a system quietly changing how it understands power. And to grasp that shift, we need to look beneath the statements, into the machinery driving them. What sits beneath this crisis is not impulse, it is a mechanism. The United States already has what it practically needs in Greenland: a long-standing military base, access agreements, strategic reach. Yet the language has shifted from presence to possession, from cooperation to control. That tells us something important about how power is being reimagined. In a more unstable world, influence feels fragile unless it is owned outright. Agreements can be renegotiated, allies can disagree, but territory feels permanent. This is the old logic of empire resurfacing in modern form. At the same time, international institutions are weaker. The United Nations is invoked, but its authority is eroded. NATO exists, but its cohesion depends on trust, and trust depends on restraint. When great powers test boundaries, they often do so not because rules vanished, but because enforcement feels uncertain. That is why Ireland's Prime Minister spoke of common sense. Not ideology, not emotion, a recognition that once the logic of acquisition returns, it rarely stops where it begins. This is no longer just about Greenland. It is about whether rules still outweigh raw leverage. And that question is about to collide with reality again in a second, sharper moment of crisis. The second crisis arrived quietly, almost reassuringly. US officials moved to soften the message. Secretary of State Marco Rubio told lawmakers there were no plans to invade Greenland. Instead, reports suggested another path: purchase, negotiation, transaction. On the surface, it sounded calming, rational, even civilized. But look closer, and the tension deepens. Buying territory in the modern world is not normal. It belongs to a different century, one where borders were commodities and people were secondary. Today, sovereignty is not a price tag, it is a principle. And suggesting a sale does not remove pressure, it reframes it. For Europe, this was not reassurance. It was confirmation that the underlying assumption remained unchanged. Greenland was being discussed without Greenland, as an object, not a polity. That is why European leaders emphasized the UN Charter's sovereignty, territorial integrity, inviolable borders. These were not abstract phrases. They were defenses against a slippery slope. Because once land can be bought, what comes next? Influence? Compliance? Silence? This moment exposed a dangerous gap between intention and perception, between what Washington may think it is signaling and what allies are hearing. And that gap is where ordinary people begin to feel the consequences, because geopolitical shifts do not stay in briefing rooms. They move outward into lives, identities, and anxieties. Now let me bring this closer to you. If you live in Europe, this is not an abstract debate about ice and maps. It is about whether the guarantees you grew up trusting still mean what you think they mean. NATO is not just a military alliance. It is a promise that power is restrained, that allies do not threaten allies. If you are Greenlandic, the stakes are even more personal. Your home is being discussed in distant capitals, framed as a strategic asset rather than a society. Decisions about your future are hinted at, negotiated around you, not with you. And if you are an ordinary citizen anywhere watching this unfold, you may feel a quiet unease. Because when great powers begin to test the language of force, it is never just about one place. It is about precedent, about what becomes acceptable next time. This is where politics stops being theoretical. It becomes emotional, human. You start to wonder who speaks for you when power starts moving faster than principle. If you believe these conversations should not happen without the people most affected, this is the moment to pay attention, to question, to stay engaged. Because what happens here will not stay here. It will ripple outward across alliances, markets, and global stability. And those ripples are already being felt far beyond Greenland's shores. Those ripples are now spreading across the global system. In the Arctic, security is not owned by one country. It is shared, fragile, interconnected, dependent on coordination among NATO allies. When unity fractures, rivals notice. Every signal sent between Washington and Europe is also received in Moscow and Beijing. Russia has long viewed the Arctic as a strategic frontier. China calls itself a near-Arctic state, investing quietly, patiently, waiting for openings. When Western allies argue publicly about sovereignty and force, it weakens their collective posture not through defeat, but through doubt. This is why the European statement mattered. It was not anti-American, it was pro-system. A reminder that Arctic security must be collective, not unilateral. That rules exist precisely to prevent escalation in regions where miscalculation is easy and consequences are vast. At the same time, the United Nations hangs in the background, invoked but constrained. Leaders speak of sovereignty and territorial integrity while acknowledging, implicitly, that enforcement depends on restraint by the powerful. This is the paradox of our moment. The system still exists, the language is still spoken, but its authority feels thinner. And when authority thins, the future no longer moves along one predictable path. It branches,